In the dusty heart of Arizona territory, where secrets buried themselves deeper than gold veins, a woman's desperate plea would echo through time. Please, don't take the cloth off. But when rugged cowboy Jake Morrison finally did what she begged him not to do, what he discovered beneath that faded piece of fabric would shatter everything he thought he knew about beauty, love, and the scars we carry. This isn't just another Western romance. This is the story of Eliza Hartwell, a woman whose past had marked her in ways that went far beyond flesh and bone. And it's about a man who would prove that sometimes the deepest wounds create the most beautiful souls. You think you know how this story ends. You think you can guess what she's hiding beneath that worn cotton cloth she never removes? I promise you, by the time Jake Morrison pulls that fabric away, your heart will be racing, your breath will catch, and you'll understand why some secrets are kept not out of shame, but out of a love so fierce it's willing to sacrifice everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began. September 1882. The Arizona territory stretched out like God's own canvas, painted in shades of rust and gold, where the desert met the sky in an endless embrace. The town of Copper Ridge had grown up around the mines, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to crouch against the harsh sun like wounded animals seeking shade. The saloon, the general store, the church with its crooked steeple, they all told the story of people trying to carve civilization out of wilderness. But it was the small boarding house on the edge of town, run by the widow Mrs. Patterson, that would become the stage for a love story unlike any other. Eliza Hartwell had arrived in Copper Ridge on the Tuesday morning stage, carrying nothing but a small leather satchel and a secret that had followed her across 3 states. At 26, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stop mid-sentence and women whisper behind their fans. Auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight, eyes the color of sage after rain, and a figure that moved with unconscious grace. But it was what she always wore that made people stare, then look away in confusion or pity. Around her throat, extending down to cover most of her chest, was a piece of soft cotton cloth, faded blue with tiny white flowers. It was always there, pinned carefully in place, never removed, not even in the scorching heat that made strong men faint. The cloth had become part of her, as essential as breathing. She'd worn it for so long that the sight of her own reflection without it could send her into trembling fits of panic. Whatever lay beneath that fabric, it was something she guarded more carefully than her own life. Jake Morrison wasn't looking for love when he rode into Copper Ridge that September. At 32, he'd seen enough of life to know that sometimes the best thing a man could hope for was honest work, a roof over his head, and whiskey that didn't burn going down. The railroad was pushing through, and they needed men who understood both horses and hard labor. Jake understood both. He stood 6'2" in his boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of other men's troubles, which he'd been doing most of his life. His dark hair was always a little too long, his jaw always carried a day's worth of stubble, and his gray eyes held the kind of shadows that came from seeing too much, too young. But there was kindness in those eyes, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his calloused hands and the Colt 45 he wore like it was part of him. Women noticed Jake Morrison. They'd have been blind not to, but he'd learned to keep his distance. Love in his experience was a luxury working men couldn't afford. That was before he saw her. It happened on a Thursday evening, just as the sun was painting the mountains purple and gold. Jake had finished his shift laying track and was walking past Mrs. Patterson's boarding house when he caught sight of her through the window. She was sitting in the parlor, reading by lamplight, and the soft glow turned her auburn hair into spun copper. He stopped, just stopped, dead in his tracks like his feet had grown roots. There was something about the way she held her head, the delicate curve of her wrist as she turned a page, the absolute stillness that surrounded her like she was carved from some precious stone. But it was the cloth at her throat that made him frown. Even in the lamplight, even through the window glass, he could see it clearly. Why would a woman wear such a thing? What could she possibly be hiding? As if she felt his gaze, Eliza looked up from her book. Their eyes met through the glass, and Jake felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It was like recognizing something he'd been searching for without knowing he'd lost it. She looked away quickly, her hand moving instinctively to touch the cloth at her throat, but not before he saw something flicker across her face. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that made every protective instinct he possessed suddenly spring to life. Over the next few days, Jake found excuses to walk past the boarding house. He told himself he was just curious, the way any man might be curious about a beautiful woman who'd appeared in his town like a character from a storybook. But the truth was deeper than curiosity. There was something about Eliza Hartwell that called to him, something beyond her obvious beauty. Maybe it was the way she never quite met anyone's eyes directly. Maybe it was how she always chose the chair in the corner, back to the wall, as if she needed to see danger coming. Or maybe it was simply the cloth itself, that mysterious guardian of whatever secret lay beneath. He learned her name from Mrs. Patterson, who was happy to gossip over coffee about her newest boarder. "Lovely girl," the older woman confided, "but she's running from something, mark my words. Women don't travel that far alone unless they're running from something. And that thing she wears around her neck never takes it off, not even to sleep, I'd wager." What Jake didn't know, what nobody in Copper Ridge knew, was that Eliza Hartwell was indeed running. She'd been running for 3 years, ever since the night that had changed everything. Ever since the night that had given her a reason to hide from the world, to cover herself in shame and fear, to believe that love was something that happened to other women. Women who weren't marked, women who weren't broken. The cloth wasn't just a piece of fabric, it was her armor, her shield, her constant reminder of why she could never let anyone too close. Especially not a man like Jake Morrison, whose gray eyes seemed to see straight through to her soul. Because Eliza knew, with the certainty of someone who'd learned life's hardest lessons, that if Jake ever saw what lay beneath the cloth, he'd turn away in disgust. They always did. The cloth protected not just her body, but her heart, and she intended to keep it that way. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Eliza sat in her small room that night, carefully pinning the cloth in place before bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. For just a moment, she let her fingers hover over the pins. What would it feel like to be free of it? To feel air against her skin? To let someone see her as she really was? Then reality crashed back, and she turned away from her reflection. Some dreams were too dangerous to entertain. Some secrets were too terrible to share. But outside her window, Jake Morrison stood in the shadow of the livery stable, looking up at the soft glow of her lamplight, and wondering what kind of pain could make a woman hide from the world. Neither of them knew that tomorrow would bring the first crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. Neither of them knew that a chance encounter in the general store would set in motion events that would change everything. And neither of them could possibly know that when Jake Morrison finally did remove that cloth, when he saw what she'd been hiding, it wouldn't be disgust that filled his eyes. It would be something far more dangerous, something that looked remarkably like love. The stage is set, the players are in position, and tomorrow, when Eliza Hartwell's carefully constructed world begins to crumble, you'll discover why some secrets are worth keeping, and why some are worth sharing with the right person. But that's a story for the next chapter, because first, Jake Morrison needs to find the courage to speak to the mysterious woman with the beautiful eyes and the terrible secret, and Eliza needs to decide whether running away is really living or just another way of dying. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Eliza made her way to Henderson's General Store, her boots clicking softly against the wooden boardwalk. The cloth at her throat felt heavier than usual, as if the desert heat was pressing it against her skin like a brand. She kept her eyes downcast, watching the hem of her navy blue dress sway with each step, acutely aware of the whispers that seemed to follow her wherever she went in this small town. "Morning, Miss Hartwell," old Mr. Henderson called out as she pushed through the door, the bell above jangling cheerfully. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and the peculiar mixture of dust and dreams that seemed to permeate every building in Copper Ridge. "What can I help you with today?" "Just some thread, please," Eliza replied softly, her fingers automatically moving to adjust the cloth at her throat. "Blue thread, if you have it." She needed to reinforce the pins that held her armor in place. The desert wind had been particularly fierce lately, and she lived in constant fear that a sudden gust might expose what she'd spent 3 years hiding. As Mr. Henderson shuffled toward the sewing supplies, muttering about inventory, Eliza allowed herself to relax slightly. The general store had become one of the few places in Copper Ridge where she felt almost normal. Here, surrounded by bolts of fabric and household goods, she could pretend she was just another woman shopping for everyday necessities. She could pretend the cloth at her throat was a fashion choice rather than a desperate necessity. She was examining a bolt of cotton when she heard the door open behind her. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor, accompanied by the soft jingle of spurs. Eliza didn't turn around, but something in the quality of the silence that followed made her pulse quicken. It was the kind of silence that came when someone was watching you, really watching you, and trying to decide whether to speak. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was deep, roughened by wind and hard work, but there was a gentleness to it that made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. She knew that voice. She'd heard it drifting through her open window in the evenings, talking to the horses at the livery stable, humming old cowboy songs while he worked. Jake Morrison, the man who'd been watching her house for days, thinking she didn't notice. The man whose gray eyes had met hers through the boarding house window and left her feeling exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the cloth she wore. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned around. He stood about 6 feet away, hat in his hands, looking for all the world like a schoolboy who'd been dared to speak to the prettiest girl in class. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd realized. Broad shoulders filled out his work shirt, and his dark hair curled slightly at the collar. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Gray as storm clouds, but warm with a kindness that made her want to trust him, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, his voice quiet enough that old Henderson couldn't hear from across the store. "I've seen you around town, and I was wondering if you might like to join me for coffee sometime. Mrs. Patterson makes a fine apple pie, and I thought maybe—" He trailed off, color rising in his cheeks as if he realized how forward he must sound. Eliza felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. The moment when someone would try to get close, to break through the careful walls she'd built around herself. The moment when she'd have to choose between the terrible loneliness that had become her constant companion and the even more terrible risk of letting someone see her as she truly was. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Morrison," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, checking that the pins were secure. I don't socialize much." But Jake didn't look discouraged. If anything, the sadness in her voice seemed to strengthen his resolve. He took a small step closer, and Eliza caught the scent of leather and soap and something indefinably masculine that made her head spin. "It's just coffee," he said gently, "and maybe a slice of pie. I promise I'm not as dangerous as I look." There was something in his tone, a hint of humor mixed with genuine concern, that made Eliza look up at him directly for the first time. The mistake was immediate and devastating. His gray eyes held no judgment, no curiosity about the cloth she wore, just a warmth that seemed to reach straight through to her soul. For one terrifying, wonderful moment, she could almost imagine what it would be like to sit across from this man, to share coffee and conversation, and pretend she was just an ordinary woman capable of ordinary pleasures. She began, then stopped, shaking her head. "I can't. I'm sorry, but I just can't." She turned to flee, to escape before she did something foolish like say yes, but in her haste she bumped into a display of canned goods. Tins went flying, clattering to the floor in a symphony of chaos that made her face burn with embarrassment. She dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather the scattered cans, her hands shaking with mortification. "Hey, it's okay," Jake said, immediately kneeling beside her to help. "These things happen. Don't worry about it." His hands were large and gentle as he gathered the cans, careful not to touch her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Eliza kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand, trying not to notice the way his presence seemed to calm something wild and frightened inside her chest. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "I know I'm just a railroad worker, Probably not the kind of man a lady like you is used to, but I'm not looking to cause you any trouble. I just thought, I thought you looked like maybe you could use a friend." The kindness in his words nearly undid her completely. When was the last time someone had offered her friendship without wanting something in return? When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen loneliness rather than the curiosity that cloth around her neck inspired? She risked a glance at his face and found him watching her with an expression so gentle it made her throat tight with unshed tears. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, and realized as she said it that it was true. She wasn't afraid of Jake Morrison. She was afraid of herself, afraid of the way her carefully constructed defenses seemed to crumble just from being near him. "It's just, it's complicated. Most worthwhile things are," Jake replied, reaching for the last can at the same time she did. Their fingers brushed, just the barest whisper of contact, but it sent electricity shooting up her arm like lightning. She jerked her hand back so quickly she nearly lost her balance, and Jake steadied her with a gentle touch to her elbow. "Sorry," he murmured, but he didn't sound sorry. He sounded like a man who'd just discovered something precious and was trying to figure out how to hold on to it without breaking it. They rose to their feet together, the last of the cans restored to their display. For a moment they stood there in the narrow aisle between the shelves, close enough that Eliza could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. Close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The rest of the world seemed to fade away. The smell of the store, the sound of Mr. Henderson shuffling around in the back room, the awareness of the cloth that covered her secret. There was only this man looking at her like she was something beautiful and valuable, like she was worth his time and attention, despite all evidence to the contrary. "Eliza," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, richer somehow, like he was tasting it on his tongue and finding it sweet. "That's your name, isn't it? Eliza?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. No one had said her name like that in 3 years, like it mattered, like she mattered. "Would you at least think about it?" he asked, and she could hear the hope in his voice, carefully controlled, but unmistakably there. "The coffee, I mean. You don't have to decide now, but would you think about it?" Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should say no, should put an end to this before it could go any further. She'd learned the hard way that men who seemed kind and understanding could turn cruel when faced with the reality of what she was hiding. She'd learned that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, that it was better to be lonely than to risk the devastating humiliation of rejection. But standing there in the warm glow of his attention, feeling seen and valued for the first time in years, those lessons seemed to come from another lifetime. This was Jake Morrison, who talked gently to horses and hummed while he worked, who just spent 5 minutes helping her clean up a mess without making her feel foolish or clumsy. This was a man who looked at her mystery and saw not something to be solved, but something to be respected. "I'll think about it," she heard herself say, the words escaping before she could stop them. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise after a long, cold night. And despite all her fears, she couldn't help but smile back. "Thank you," he said simply. And she knew he meant more than just thank you for considering coffee. He meant thank you for not running away. Thank you for giving him a chance. Thank you for standing here in this moment and letting him see even this small glimpse of who she really was. "Miss Hartwell?" Mr. Henderson's voice broke the spell, and they both stepped back, the careful distance reasserting itself. "Found that blue thread you were looking for. Will there be anything else?" "No, that's everything," Eliza managed, her voice slightly breathless. She moved toward the counter, acutely aware of Jake's presence behind her, of the way he seemed to take up more space than his physical form should allow. As she paid for her thread, she could feel him watching her, could sense the questions he was too polite to ask. About the cloth, about why a woman would choose to cover herself so completely in weather that made grown men strip to their shirt sleeves, about what could be so terrible that it needed to be hidden from the world. But he didn't ask. He simply waited, patient as stone, until she'd concluded her business. As she turned to leave, he stepped forward, not to block her path, but to open the door for her, a simple gesture that somehow felt more intimate than a kiss. "Good day, Miss Hartwell," he said formally, but his eyes held promises and possibilities that made her pulse race. "I hope to see you again soon." Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice, and stepped out into the blazing Arizona sun. As she walked back toward the boarding house, she could feel him watching her through the store window, could imagine those storm-gray eyes following her progress down the street. Her hand moved unconsciously to the cloth at her throat, and for the first time in 3 years, she found herself wondering not what would happen if someone discovered her secret, but what it might feel like to share it willingly. Behind her, Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of Henderson's general store, watching the woman who just turned his world upside down disappear around the corner. He thought about the sadness he'd seen in her sage-green eyes, the careful way she held herself as if she were made of glass and might shatter at any moment. He thought about the mystery of that cloth she wore, and the way her hand had fluttered to it like a butterfly seeking safety whenever she felt threatened. Most of all, he thought about the moment when their fingers had touched, when he'd felt something electric pass between them, something that had made her jerk away like she'd been burned. But not before he'd seen her pupils dilate, not before he'd caught the sharp intake of breath that suggested she'd felt it too. Whatever she was hiding, whatever had put that haunted look in her eyes, Jake Morrison found himself more determined than ever to prove that some secrets were safe with the right person. Some wounds could heal, given time and patience, and the kind of gentle care he was more than willing to provide. The only question was whether Eliza Hartwell would be brave enough to let him try. For 3 days after their encounter in the general store, Eliza found herself thinking about Jake Morrison's invitation with an obsession that bordered on madness. She would catch herself staring out her bedroom window toward the railroad camps, watching for glimpses of his tall figure among the workers. She would lie awake at night, her fingers tracing the edges of the cloth at her throat, wondering what it would feel like to sit across from him in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, to share coffee and conversation like a normal woman capable of normal pleasures. The rational part of her mind cataloged all the reasons why accepting his invitation would be a mistake. She was in Copper Ridge to disappear, not to form attachments. She had learned the hard way that men who seemed kind and understanding could turn cruel when faced with the reality of what lay beneath her careful coverings. She had built her life around the principle that solitude was safety, that the only way to avoid the devastating pain of rejection was to never give anyone the opportunity to reject her in the first place. But there was another voice in her head, quieter but more insistent, that whispered dangerous possibilities. What if Jake Morrison was different? What if the gentleness she saw in his storm-gray eyes was genuine? What if, for once in her life, she could experience the simple pleasure of human connection without the constant fear of discovery? On the third evening, as she sat in the boarding house parlor, pretending to read while actually watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Mrs. Patterson settled into the chair beside her with a knowing smile. "That Morrison fellow has been asking about you," the older woman said without preamble, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked. "Wanted to know if you were settling in well, if you needed anything, seemed mighty concerned about your welfare." Eliza's hands tightened on her book, but she kept her voice carefully neutral. "That's very kind of him, but I'm managing perfectly well on my own." "I'm sure you are, dear," Mrs. Patterson replied, but her tone suggested she saw right through the pretense. "Though I can't help noticing you seem a bit lonely. Might do you good to make a friend or two while you're here. Mr. Morrison strikes me as the reliable sort, the kind of man a woman can count on to behave like a gentleman." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mrs. Patterson had been running a boarding house for 15 years. She'd seen all kinds of people, and she had an uncanny ability to read the stories written in their faces. Eliza wondered what story her own face told, whether the older woman could see past the carefully constructed facade to the desperate longing underneath. "I appreciate your concern," Eliza said finally, "but I'm not looking to complicate my life with social obligations." Mrs. Patterson's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "Child, what's complicated about sharing a cup of coffee with a decent man? You're young and pretty, and life's too short to spend it hiding away like you're afraid of your own shadow." She resumed her knitting, adding more gently, "Sometimes the things we're most afraid of are the very things we need most." That night, Eliza stood before her mirror in the small bedroom, her reflection wavering in the lamplight like a ghost unsure of its own existence. The cloth at her throat seemed to glow in the golden light, a constant reminder of why she couldn't afford to listen to Mrs. Patterson's well-meaning advice. She raised her hand toward the pins that held her secret in place, then stopped, her fingers trembling with a mixture of longing and terror. What lay beneath that fabric had defined her for 3 years. It had shaped every decision, influenced every relationship, dictated the very way she moved through the world. But for the first time since that terrible night, she found herself wondering if perhaps she had given it too much power. Perhaps she had allowed her shame to become a prison of her own making. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the desert look like God's own cathedral. Eliza dressed with unusual care, choosing her best dress, a deep emerald green that brought out the color of her eyes, and spending extra time arranging her hair. The cloth at her throat was freshly cleaned and carefully pinned, but for the first time in years, she didn't spend long minutes checking and rechecking its security. She found Jake at the railroad camp just as the morning shift was ending, standing beside the massive steam engine that had become as familiar a sight in Copper Ridge as the church steeple. He was talking to another worker, gesturing with oil-stained hands as he explained some mechanical detail, but when he caught sight of her approaching, his face lit up with a smile that made her heart skip dangerously in her chest. "Miss Hartwell," he said, excusing himself from his conversation and walking toward her with that easy, confident stride she'd come to recognize. "This is a pleasant surprise." Up close, in the harsh light of the desert sun, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly with sweat from his morning's work. He smelled of honest labor and desert air, and there was something so fundamentally solid about his presence that she felt some of the anxiety that had been gnawing at her all morning begin to ease. "I've been thinking about your invitation," she said without preamble, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "The coffee, I mean, if the offer still stands." The smile that spread across his face was like watching the sun rise over the mountains. "It absolutely still stands. When would be convenient for you?" "This afternoon?" The words came out in a rush before her courage could desert her. "Around 3 o'clock? Mrs. Patterson said she'd have fresh apple pie ready by then." 3 o'clock sounds perfect," Jake replied, and Eliza could hear the careful control in his voice, as if he were trying not to sound too eager and scare her away. "Should I come to the boarding house, or would you prefer to meet somewhere else?" The question made her realize she hadn't thought through the practical details of her impulsive decision. Where did a woman with a secret meet a man for coffee? How did she maintain the careful distance she needed while still allowing for the connection she craved? The boarding house parlor would be fine, she decided. It was public enough to maintain propriety, private enough for real conversation, and familiar enough that she might be able to relax despite the hammering of her heart. "Then I'll see you at 3, Jake said, his gray eyes warm with anticipation. "Thank you, Eliza, for giving me a chance." The way he said her name, with such careful attention to each syllable, made something flutter dangerously in her chest. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned to go before she could change her mind. The hours between morning and afternoon stretched like elastic, each minute crawling by with agonizing slowness. Eliza found herself unable to focus on anything, starting tasks only to abandon them halfway through. She rearranged her already tidy room twice, changed her dress 3 times, and stood before her mirror, adjusting and readjusting the cloth at her throat until her fingers were raw from the pins. By the time 3 o'clock arrived, she was wound so tight with nervous energy that she jumped at the sound of his knock on the boarding house door. Mrs. Patterson answered with obvious delight, ushering Jake into the parlor with the kind of maternal fussing that made Eliza simultaneously grateful and mortified. "Coffee's fresh," the older woman announced, setting out her best china service with obvious pleasure. "And I've got that apple pie you mentioned, Mr. Morrison, still warm from the oven." Jake had cleaned up from his morning's work, Eliza noticed. His dark hair was still damp from washing, and he wore a clean white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the surprising gentleness of his hands. But it was the way he looked at her, with such focused attention, as if she were the only person in the room, that made her breath catch in her throat. "You look beautiful," he said simply, as Mrs. Patterson bustled out to give them privacy. The compliment was delivered without artifice or expectation, just a statement of fact that made heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you," Eliza managed, settling into her usual chair in the corner, while Jake took the seat across from her. The small table between them felt like both a barrier and a bridge, keeping them at a safe distance while creating an intimate space that belonged only to them. For the first few minutes, they talked about safe topics: the weather, the progress of the railroad, the remarkable growth of Copper Ridge from mining camp to actual town. Jake had a way of listening that made Eliza feel heard, really heard, in a way she hadn't experienced in years. He asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in her answers, even when she carefully deflected any inquiries about her past. "What brought you to Arizona territory?" he asked, cutting a generous slice of Mrs. Patterson's apple pie and sliding it across to her. It's not exactly the kind of place most ladies choose for a vacation. The question she'd been dreading since the moment she'd accepted his invitation. Eliza took a careful sip of coffee, using the time to craft her response. She'd rehearsed various versions of her story, each one containing just enough truth to be believable, while omitting the details that would send any decent man running. "I needed a fresh start," she said finally, which was true enough. Sometimes a person reaches a point where the only way forward is to leave everything behind and begin again somewhere completely different. Jake nodded slowly, and she could see understanding in his gray eyes, not just of her words, but of the pain that lay beneath them. "I know something about fresh starts," he said quietly. "Left Indiana 3 years ago after my life there fell apart. Figured the further west I went, the better chance I'd have of outrunning my mistakes." The admission created a moment of unexpected intimacy between them. Here was this strong, capable man confessing his own vulnerabilities, sharing his own history of running away. Eliza felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight bands of fear that had constricted her breathing for so long. "What kind of mistakes?" she asked gently, surprising herself with her boldness. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he'd been carrying for years. When he looked up at her, his expression was raw with remembered pain. "I was engaged," he said finally, "to a woman named Catherine. Beautiful, proper, everything a man was supposed to want in a wife. But I was working too much, drinking too much, trying too hard to prove myself to her father, and not paying enough attention to what she actually needed." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "She left me for my best friend, married him 2 months later." "I'm sorry," Eliza said, and meant it. She could see how much the betrayal had cost him, could recognize the kind of deep wound that changed the way a person looked at love, and trust, and the possibility of happiness. "Ancient history now," Jake replied with a shrug that didn't quite hide the lingering hurt. "But it taught me some valuable lessons about what really matters. About not taking good things for granted when you find them." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Eliza felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze, felt the dangerous flutter of hope in her chest. Was he talking about her? Was she a good thing he didn't want to take for granted? "What about you?" he asked gently. "What are you running from?" The question she'd been dreading arrived with such quiet inevitability that she almost felt relieved. Here it was, the moment of truth, the point where she would have to choose between the safety of lies and the terrifying vulnerability of honesty. She looked at Jake's face, at the patient kindness in his storm gray eyes, and felt the walls she'd built around her heart developing hairline cracks. "I was hurt," she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper, "by someone I trusted, and I've been hiding ever since." The truth of it, even stripped of details, felt dangerous and liberating at the same time. She watched Jake's face carefully, looking for signs of judgment or curiosity, or the kind of predatory interest that some men showed when they sensed weakness in a woman. Instead, she saw only compassion. His hand moved across the table toward hers, stopping just short of actual contact. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could hear the genuine anger in his voice. Not at her, but at whoever had hurt her badly enough to send her running across 3 states. "I'm sorry someone made you feel like you needed to hide." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her completely. When was the last time someone had been angry on her behalf? When was the last time someone had looked at her pain and seen injustice rather than shame? It's complicated, she managed, the words inadequate to describe the tangle of fear and shame and desperate longing that had ruled her life for 3 years. Most worthwhile things are, Jake replied, echoing his words from their encounter in the general store. His hand was still stretched across the table toward hers, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. But that doesn't mean they're not worth the effort. Eliza stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, seeing not just the calluses and scars that marked him as a working man, but the steadiness, the patience, the quiet strength that promised safety in a world that had taught her to expect cruelty. Slowly, carefully, as if she were handling something precious and fragile, she reached across the table and placed her hand in his. The contact was electric, sending warmth shooting up her arm and settling in her chest like a banked fire. His fingers closed around hers with gentle pressure, calloused skin surprisingly soft against her palm. For a moment they sat like that, hands joined across the small table, while the afternoon light slanted through the parlor windows, and somewhere in the kitchen Mrs. Patterson hummed contentedly as she worked. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a caress so light she might have imagined it, "for trusting me this much, for giving me a chance." Eliza felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple human contact she'd denied herself for so long. His hand was warm and solid and real, anchoring her to a moment that felt stolen from someone else's life. A normal woman's life. A woman who could hold hands with a man without constant fear of discovery, who could accept kindness without waiting for the inevitable moment when it would be withdrawn. "I don't know if I can be what you're looking for," she whispered, her free hand moving instinctively to the cloth at her throat. I'm not like other women. I can't offer you the things that most men want." Jake's grip on her hand tightened slightly, not possessive but protective, as if he could somehow hold her together through the force of his own conviction. "What I want," he said, his voice low and intense, "is to know the woman behind those beautiful eyes. The woman who's brave enough to start over in a place where she knows no one, who's strong enough to survive whatever it was that hurt her so badly. That's what I want, Eliza. Just you. However you come." The words hit her like a physical blow, beautiful and terrible and completely unexpected. How was she supposed to respond to such naked honesty? How was she supposed to maintain her carefully constructed defenses when he looked at her like she was something precious, something worth fighting for? "You don't know what you're saying," she managed. But even as she spoke the words, she could hear the hope creeping into her voice, dangerous and insidious and impossible to suppress. "Maybe not," Jake admitted, his gray eyes never leaving her face. "But I'd like the chance to find out, if you'll let me." Before Eliza could respond, before she could find words adequate to the moment, Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted in from the kitchen, breaking the spell that had woven itself around them. "More coffee, you two? Or perhaps some of my molasses cookies?" They sprang apart as if they'd been caught doing something scandalous, hands retreating to their respective sides of the table, the moment of intimate connection dissolving into awkward self-consciousness. But the echo of it lingered in the air between them, a promise and a possibility that couldn't be taken back. "We should probably," Eliza began, but Jake was already nodding, understanding the unspoken need to retreat before they went too far too fast. "Of course," he said, rising to his feet with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements. "Thank you for the coffee. And the conversation. I hope we can do this again soon." "I'd like that," Eliza replied, and was surprised to discover she meant it. Despite her fears, despite the voice in her head that cataloged all the ways this could go wrong, she genuinely wanted to see him again. Jake smiled, that warm, genuine expression that seemed to light up his entire face. "Tomorrow evening. There's a place by the creek where the cottonwoods grow. It's peaceful there. Good for talking, if you'd be interested." A walk by the creek, away from the safety of the boarding house, away from Mrs. Patterson's protective presence. It was exactly the kind of risk Eliza had spent 3 years avoiding, and exactly the kind of opportunity she'd been secretly yearning for. "Yes," she heard herself say, the word escaping before her rational mind could intervene. Yes, I'd be interested. As Jake left, tipping his hat with old-fashioned courtesy, Eliza remained seated in the parlor, her hands still tingling where he'd touched her. She could feel Mrs. Patterson watching her with knowing eyes, could sense the older woman's approval and encouragement. But more than that, she could feel something awakening inside herself, something that had been dormant for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, wonderful hope that maybe, just maybe, Jake Morrison was the kind of man who could look at her secrets and see not shame, but strength. The kind of man who could touch her scars, all of them, visible and invisible, and find her beautiful anyway. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time in 3 years, it made her feel almost alive. But as she climbed the stairs to her room that evening, her hand moved unconsciously to the cloth at her throat, and she couldn't help wondering what would happen when Jake Morrison finally asked the question she could see forming in his storm-gray eyes. "What are you hiding from me?" The cottonwoods by Willow Creek whispered secrets to the evening breeze as Eliza made her way along the well-worn path, her heart hammering against her ribs with each step. Jake was waiting beside the largest cottonwood, his tall frame leaning against the silvered bark. When he saw her approaching, his face lit up with that smile that never failed to make her pulse quicken. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I almost didn't," Eliza admitted, her hand moving unconsciously to the cloth at her throat. "But I realized I've spent too many evenings alone with my thoughts lately." They began walking along the creek bank, the water gurgling softly over rocks. Dragonflies skimmed the surface like living jewels in the fading sunlight. It was peaceful here, and Eliza felt some tension ease from her shoulders. "Tell me about Indiana," she said, wanting to focus on his past rather than risk questions about her own. Jake was quiet for a moment. "Green," he said finally. "So green it hurt your eyes. Nothing like this place." He paused, kicking a stone into the creek. "But I don't miss the person I was there." "What kind of person were you?" Eliza asked softly. "Someone who got caught up in trying to impress people who didn't matter," Jake replied, his voice heavy with regret. "I started gambling, drinking too much, running with men who thought success was measured in money. Catherine tried to warn me, but I was too proud to listen." "What happened?" "I lost everything. The farm, our savings, Catherine's respect. The night she left, she said I wasn't the man she'd fallen in love with anymore." His voice was raw with remembered pain. Without thinking, Eliza reached out and touched his arm. "I'm sorry. That must have been devastating." Jake covered her hand with his own, his palm warm against her skin. "It was. But maybe I needed to lose everything to figure out what actually mattered." "And what matters?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for his answer. "This," he said simply, "real conversation with someone who sees past the surface. The chance to be honest and still be accepted." They'd stopped beneath a massive willow whose branches created a natural canopy. The air felt cooler here, touched with moisture from the creek. "I know you're carrying something heavy, Eliza," Jake continued, his gray eyes intense. "I can see it in how you hold yourself, how your hand always goes to that cloth when you're nervous. I don't know what happened, but I know it was bad enough to send you running." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "You don't understand. What I'm hiding isn't just emotional scars. It's something visible, something that changes how people look at me." Jake was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing gentle patterns across her hand. "3 years ago, I would have said appearances matter most. But I've learned what's really valuable. Whatever you think is terrible doesn't change that you're the most beautiful woman I've ever met." "You haven't seen—" "Then show me," Jake interrupted gently. "Whatever you're afraid of, show me. Let me prove it doesn't matter." The words hit her like a physical blow. Show him. After 3 years of hiding, here was this man asking her to trust him with her deepest secret. "I can't," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "You don't know what you're asking." Instead of pushing, Jake simply nodded. "Okay, but will you tell me what happened? Will you trust me with the story?" Eliza looked at him through the gathering dusk. In his gray eyes, she saw nothing but patience and genuine caring. "It was 3 years ago," she began quietly. I was living in St. Louis, working as a seamstress. I had a small apartment above a bakery. She paused, gathering courage. There was a fire in the middle of the night. The bakery caught fire, and by the time I woke up, the whole building was burning. Even now, she could still smell the smoke, still feel the heat. I tried to get out through the front door, but it was blocked by flames. The only way out was through the window. Her voice became barely audible. I jumped from the second story, but my nightgown caught fire, and by the time someone put out the flames, she touched the cloth at her throat with trembling fingers. The burns were extensive, from here down to here. Her hand gestured toward her chest, then stopped. Jake's face had gone very still, but she could see anger building in his eyes. Not at her, but at the cruelty of fate. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, she continued, but I didn't feel lucky. The scarring was extensive. Keloid scars, raised and twisted. She shuddered. That's not the worst part. There was a man I'd been seeing, someone I thought cared about me. When I finally showed him what the fire had done, she stopped, the memory too painful. He left, Jake said, his voice flat with disgust. Eliza nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. He said he was sorry, but he couldn't look at me the same way. So I ran. I couldn't stand the stares, the pity. I bought the cloth and started moving west. They stood in silence, only the creek's murmur and wind through branches breaking the quiet. Thank you, Jake said finally, for trusting me with that. It's the first time I've told anyone, Eliza admitted. Jake reached out slowly and cupped her face gently in his hands, brushing away her tears. What that man did wasn't love. That was cowardice. Real love doesn't abandon someone because they've been marked by life. You say that now, but you haven't seen. It doesn't matter, Jake interrupted softly. Whatever those scars look like, they don't define you. They're proof you're a survivor, stronger than fire and pain and cruel people who don't deserve you. Instead of answering with words, Jake leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it felt like a prayer. Eliza melted into it, her hands fisting in his shirt as 3 years of loneliness began to crack open. When they broke apart, Jake rested his forehead against hers. That's how I know, he said quietly. When I look at you, I see strength and beauty and courage. I see a woman I'm falling in love with. The words hit her like lightning. Jake, she breathed, but as she tilted her head back, she felt something shift. The kiss had loosened a pin, and the cloth slipped slightly, exposing just a hint of scarred skin. Panic shot through her. Her hands flew to her throat, frantically adjusting the cloth. Oh God, you saw. Eliza, it's okay, Jake said calmly. Look at me. Look at my face. She forced herself to meet his eyes. There was no disgust, no revulsion, only concern for her distress and something that looked like wonder. What I saw, he said carefully, was skin that's been through trauma and healed. That's all. Just skin that tells a story of survival. But it's hideous, she whispered. It's part of you, Jake said firmly. And you are not hideous. You are beautiful, scars and all. As the last sunlight faded and stars appeared, Eliza felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't immediately fix the cloth. She let herself be seen, even partially, by this man who'd proven worthy of her trust. What happens now? She asked. Jake smiled. Now I walk you home, and tomorrow, if you'll let me, I'd like to see you again. Maybe when you're ready, you can show me more of who you really are. As they walked back toward town, Eliza found herself thinking about possibilities she'd thought were closed forever. Maybe love wasn't just for unmarked women. Maybe there were men who could see past scars. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, part of her wondered what would happen when Jake saw all of her scars. Would his acceptance hold when faced with the full extent of what the fire had done? Only time would tell. But tonight it was enough to walk beside him and nurture the tiny flame of hope his words had kindled. The 3 days following their evening by the creek passed like a fever dream for Eliza. She found herself caught between two warring emotions: the intoxicating hope that Jake's acceptance might be real, and the bone-deep terror that she was setting herself up for the kind of devastating heartbreak that had sent her fleeing across the country 3 years ago. Every morning she woke with his words echoing in her mind. You are beautiful, scars and all. Every night she lay awake touching the cloth at her throat, remembering the wonder in his eyes when he'd glimpsed that small patch of damaged skin. But in the harsh light of day, doubt crept in like desert sand, finding every crack in her defenses. What if he changed his mind? What if seeing more of her scars proved too much for his good intentions? What if she was just fooling herself again, the way she had with Thomas in St. Louis? Jake had been patient, giving her space to process what had happened between them. But she could see him watching her when she walked through town, could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. There was something different in his eyes now, not just tenderness, but a kind of hungry intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. It was the look of a man who'd been given a tantalizing glimpse of something he wanted and was trying to figure out how to see more. On Thursday evening, as Eliza sat in the boarding house parlor pretending to read while actually staring at the same page for the 20th time, Mrs. Patterson settled beside her with a knowing smile. That Morrison fellow stopped by this afternoon while you were out, the older woman said, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Left these for you. She gestured toward a small bundle wrapped in brown paper that sat on the side table. Eliza's heart skipped as she reached for the package. Inside was a book of poetry by Walt Whitman and a single wildflower pressed between two sheets of paper. A note in Jake's careful handwriting read, "Thought you might enjoy this. The flower reminded me of your eyes. Jay." Seems like a thoughtful man, Mrs. Patterson observed, watching Eliza's face carefully. The kind who pays attention to details. Yes, Eliza murmured, her fingers tracing the pressed flower's delicate petals. Perhaps too much attention? Mrs. Patterson's needles paused. There's no such thing as too much attention from the right person, dear. The question is whether you're brave enough to let yourself find out if he's the right person. That night, Eliza sat by her window, reading Jake's Gift by lamplight. Whitman's bold, passionate verses seemed to speak directly to the longing she'd been trying so hard to suppress. I sing the body electric. And if the body does not do fully as much as the soul, and if the body were not the soul, what is the soul? The words made her think of Jake's hands on her face, the reverence in his touch when he'd kissed her. Made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could be the kind of man who saw bodies not as objects of judgment, but as vessels for souls. The kind of man who could love a woman whose vessel had been damaged, but whose soul remained whole. Friday morning brought an invitation she'd been both hoping for and dreading. Jake appeared at the boarding house door just as she was finishing breakfast, his hat in his hands and an expression of determined nervousness on his face. I was wondering, he said, his voice carefully controlled, if you might like to have dinner with me tonight. Not here, he added quickly, seeing her start to speak. I mean, I've arranged something special, private, if you're comfortable with that. Eliza felt her pulse quicken. Private meant away from the safety of witnesses, away from the protective presence of Mrs. Patterson and her other boarders. Private meant the possibility of more intimate conversation, more questions she wasn't ready to answer, more opportunities for him to ask to see what she'd spent 3 years hiding. I don't know if that's wise, she said softly, her hand moving instinctively to her throat. Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the soap he'd used that morning, see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. Eliza, I know you're frightened. I can see it in your face every time you look at me. But running away from this, from us, won't make the fear go away. It'll just make you lonelier. The truth in his words hit her like a physical blow. She had been running, not just across the country, but away from any possibility of connection, of intimacy, of the kind of love she thought was lost to her forever. Where? She asked, the word escaping before her rational mind could stop it. Jake's smile was like sunrise. There's an old line shack about 2 miles north of town. Used to belong to a cattle outfit that moved on last year. It's got a fireplace, a table, even some dishes left behind. I thought maybe we could have dinner there. Just the two of us. Somewhere we could talk without worrying about who might be listening. The suggestion sent alarm bells ringing through her mind. Alone with him, miles from town, with no one to hear if things went wrong. It was exactly the kind of situation she'd been avoiding for 3 years, But looking into his earnest face, seeing the careful way he held himself, close enough to show his interest, but far enough away to let her choose, she felt her resolve wavering. "I'll bring everything," he continued, misinterpreting her silence as reluctance about the logistics. "Food, wine, even wildflowers for the table. All you have to do is say yes." Eliza stared at him for a long moment. This man who seemed to see straight through to her soul, who asked for her trust with such patient confidence. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to maintain the safe distance that had protected her for so long. But a stronger voice, one she'd been trying to ignore, whispered that maybe it was time to stop letting fear make her decisions. "Yes," she heard herself say, the words soft but clear. "Yes, I'll have dinner with you." The joy that spread across Jake's face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," he said simply, but she could hear the depth of his gratitude. "I'll come for you at 6. That afternoon passed in a haze of nervous preparation. Eliza changed her dress 3 times, settled on her best blue silk, then changed again to the more practical brown wool. She spent an hour in front of the mirror adjusting and readjusting the cloth at her throat, adding extra pins, checking that every inch of scarred skin was securely covered. But even as she made these familiar preparations, she found herself wondering what would happen if the cloth slipped again. Would Jake's acceptance hold if he saw more? Would he still look at her with that mixture of tenderness and desire that made her feel beautiful for the first time in years? Jake arrived promptly at 6, driving a small wagon loaded with what looked like enough supplies for a week. He cleaned up from his day's work and wore his best shirt, the white cotton crisp against his tan skin. When he helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hands were gentle but sure, and the brief contact sent warmth shooting up her arms. The ride to the line shack passed in comfortable conversation about safe topics: the weather, the progress of the railroad, the remarkable growth of Copper Ridge. But underneath the casual words, Eliza could feel the tension building, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The line shack sat in a small grove of cottonwoods, its rough-hewn logs weathered silver by sun and wind. Jake had clearly been there earlier to prepare. Wildflowers in mason jars decorated a table set with mismatched dishes, and a fire crackled welcomingly in the stone fireplace. It looked like something from a fairy tale, rustic and romantic and completely removed from the harsh realities of desert life. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, and meant it. But even as she admired his thoughtful preparations, part of her mind was cataloging escape routes, noting how far they were from town, how isolated this place was if things went wrong. Jake seemed to sense her nervousness. "We can go back anytime you want," he said quietly. "Just say the word." But as they sat down to dinner, venison stew and fresh bread with apple pie for dessert, Eliza found herself relaxing despite her fears. Jake was an excellent companion, funny and thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her opinions. He told stories of his railroad work that made her laugh, asked questions about her life that showed real curiosity without pushing for details she wasn't ready to share. It was only when they'd finished eating and moved to sit by the fire that the atmosphere began to shift, becoming charged with the kind of electric tension that made the air itself seem to hum. "Thank you for this," Eliza said, gesturing to encompass the entire evening. "It's been lovely. More lovely than I expected." "More lovely than you expected," Jake repeated, moving his chair closer to hers. "What did you expect?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know. Questions, maybe. Pressure to reveal things I'm not ready to reveal." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice was careful. "Is that what you think I want? To pressure you?" "Isn't it?" Eliza asked, her hand moving unconsciously to her throat. "Isn't that what men always want? To see, to touch, to possess?" "Some men, maybe," Jake replied, his gray eyes serious. "But not me. Not like that." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What I want is to know you, Eliza. All of you. Not just your body, but your mind, your heart, your dreams, your fears. I want to understand what makes you laugh and what makes you cry and what you think about when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning." The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. "And the scars? You're saying you don't want to see them?" Jake's expression grew very still. I won't lie to you. Yes, I want to see them. Not because I'm curious about the damage, but because they're part of your story. Because hiding from them, hiding from me, is causing you pain, and I hate seeing you in pain. You don't understand, Eliza said, her voice rising slightly with the panic that always came when this topic arose. They're not just scars, Jake. They're ugly, twisted, the kind of thing that makes people look away in disgust. Have I looked away? Jake asked quietly. You haven't seen them. I've seen enough. He reached out slowly and touched her hand where it rested on the chair arm. And what I've seen is that you're the most beautiful woman I've ever met, scars and all. Stop saying that, Eliza said, pulling her hand away and standing abruptly. Stop acting like you know what you're talking about when you haven't seen the worst of it. Jake stood too, moving toward her with that careful, deliberate grace that characterized all his actions. Then show me. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eliza felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the familiar panic rising in her throat like bile. No, she said, backing away from him. No, I can't. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you to trust me, Jake said, continuing his slow advance. I'm asking you to believe that what I feel for you is stronger than whatever you think is so terrible about your appearance. And what if you're wrong? Eliza demanded, her voice breaking. What if you see me and realize you can't stomach it? What if you do what Thomas did and walk away because you can't stand to look at me? Jake stopped moving, his expression growing fierce. I am not Thomas, he said, his voice low and intense. I am not some coward who runs at the first sign that life isn't perfect. I am a man who has seen real ugliness in this world, cruelty, greed, hatred, and I know the difference between surface imperfections and true beauty. You say that now, Eliza whispered, tears starting to slip down her cheeks. But you haven't seen... Then let me see, Jake interrupted, taking another step toward her. Stop telling me what I can't handle and let me prove what I can. They stood facing each other across the small room, the fire crackling between them, both breathing hard with the intensity of the moment. Eliza could see the determination in Jake's face, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as if he were fighting the urge to reach for her. Please, she said, her voice barely audible, please don't ask this of me. I can't bear it if you look at me the way he did. Something in her tone must have reached him because Jake's expression softened. He held up his hands in a gesture of surrender, taking a small step back. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, I won't push. But Eliza... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Hiding from intimacy isn't living. It's just existing. And you deserve so much more than that. The words hit her like arrows, each one finding its mark in the vulnerable places she tried so hard to protect. Because he was right, wasn't he? For 3 years she'd been existing rather than living, going through the motions of daily life, while her heart remained locked away behind walls of fear and shame. I want to, she admitted, the confession torn from somewhere deep inside her. God help me, I want to trust you. I want to believe that you could see all of me and still... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Still love you? Jake supplied gently. The word hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross. Love. Not attraction, not desire, but love. The kind of deep, abiding acceptance that could see past imperfections to the soul underneath. I'm falling in love with you, Eliza, Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. Not with the idea of you, not with what you might look like under that cloth, but with you. The woman who reads poetry by lamplight, who's kind to Mrs. Patterson even when she's being intrusive, who survived something terrible and came out stronger. That woman is beautiful, no matter what scars she carries. Eliza felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble under the weight of his words. But even as hope bloomed, fear rose to meet it. What if you change your mind, she whispered. What if loving me becomes too hard when you see what I really look like? Jake moved closer, slowly enough that she could stop him if she wanted to, until he was near enough to touch. Then I guess you'll have to have enough faith for both of us, he said softly. Faith that real love doesn't give up when things get difficult. Faith that I'm the kind of man who keeps his promises. What promises? Eliza asked, though part of her already knew. This one, Jake said, reaching out to frame her face gently in his hands. I promise that whatever you show me, however you look, I will not turn away. I will not make you feel ashamed or ugly or unworthy of love. I promise to see you, really see you, and love you anyway. The words were like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, beautiful and terrifying and impossible to look away from. Eliza stared into his gray eyes, searching for some sign of doubt or reservation, but found only steady conviction. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice breaking on the words. I know, Jake said gently, but you don't have to be scared alone anymore. And then, before she could think of all the reasons why it was a terrible idea, before her rational mind could catalog all the ways this could go wrong, Eliza found herself nodding. Okay, she whispered, but not here, not tonight. I need time to prepare myself. Jake's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Tomorrow night, then. Here, if you're comfortable with that. And Eliza? He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Thank you for trusting me with this, for trusting me with you. As they made the drive back to town in companionable silence, Eliza's mind raced with the enormity of what she'd just promised. Tomorrow night, she would show Jake Morrison what lay beneath the cloth she'd worn for 3 years. She would expose the twisted, angry scars that marked her chest and throat, and she would discover once and for all whether love was stronger than revulsion. The thought terrified her, but for the first time in 3 years, she found herself more excited than afraid. Because maybe, just maybe, Jake Morrison was the kind of man who could see past scars to the woman underneath. The kind of man who could love her not despite her imperfections, but because of the strength it had taken to survive them. Tomorrow night, she would find out. Tomorrow night, she would finally stop hiding and discover whether true love was real or just a fairy tale she'd been foolish enough to believe in. The day that would change everything dawned gray and heavy, with storm clouds gathering on the western horizon like an omen of things to come. Eliza woke before sunrise, her body rigid with tension, her mind already racing with the terrible certainty of what she'd promised to do that evening. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince herself she could go through with it. For 3 years, the cloth at her throat had been her shield, her protection against a world that judged by appearances. The thought of removing it voluntarily, of exposing herself to Jake's gaze, made her stomach churn with nausea. But the memory of his words the night before, his promise not to turn away, his confession of love, gave her just enough courage to rise and face the day. Mrs. Patterson noticed her distraction at breakfast, commenting gently on her pale complexion and obvious nerves. Big day today, dear? The older woman asked, her knitting needles clicking sympathetically. Something like that, Eliza managed, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate without really eating them. Whatever it is you're facing, remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, Mrs. Patterson said with the wisdom of her years. It's doing what's right despite being afraid. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eliza tried to occupy herself with reading, with mending, with anything that might distract her from the approaching evening. But nothing worked. Her hands shook whenever she tried to hold a needle, and the words on the pages blurred together until they became meaningless marks on paper. At 3 o'clock, Jake appeared at the boarding house with a bouquet of desert wildflowers and an expression of such gentle concern that it nearly broke her heart. He could see her fear, could read the panic in her face as clearly as if she'd written it there in ink. We don't have to do this tonight, he said immediately, settling beside her on the porch swing. If you're not ready, we can wait. There's no rush. Eliza looked at him, this patient, understanding man who was willing to postpone his own desires for her comfort, and felt something strengthen inside her chest. No, she said quietly. I need to do this. I need to stop being afraid of my own skin. Jake nodded slowly, reaching out to cover her trembling hand with his steady one. Then I'll be there. Whatever happens, however you look, I'll be there. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, They made the familiar journey to the lion's shack. But this time, the silence between them was different, charged with anticipation and terror in equal measure. Eliza's hand kept moving to her throat, checking and rechecking that the pins were secure, even as she knew she would soon remove them herself. The lion's shack looked exactly as it had the night before, romantic and welcoming, with wildflowers on the table and a fire crackling in the hearth. But to Eliza, it felt like a stage set for either the most beautiful or most devastating moment of her life. Jake had brought wine, she noticed, and her favorite apple pie from Mrs. Patterson's kitchen, but she couldn't imagine eating anything with her stomach tied in knots. "How do you want to do this?" Jake asked gently, settling into the chair across from her as they had the previous evening. His voice was carefully neutral, giving her control over the situation. "I don't know," Eliza admitted, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. I mean, no one has seen me without the cloth since the doctor who treated my burns. Not even my mirror shows me everything at once." The confession revealed just how complete her self-imposed isolation had been. For 3 years, she'd avoided even looking at her own scars, changing clothes in darkness, bathing by feel alone. She'd made herself a stranger to her own body. Jake leaned forward, his gray eyes intense with emotion. "Eliza, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "Whatever you're about to show me, remember that I already know you. I know your kindness, your strength, your courage. I know the way you laugh at my terrible jokes and how you bite your lip when you're thinking hard about something. Those things aren't changing, no matter what's under that cloth." His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, but they couldn't quite dispel the cold terror that had settled in her bones. With shaking hands, she reached up and began to remove the pins that held her secret in place. Each small piece of metal felt impossibly heavy as she set it aside on the table between them. "Maybe you should close your eyes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Until I'm ready." Jake shook his head. "I want to watch. I want to see you choosing to trust me. That's beautiful, too." The cloth felt strange in her hands as she loosened it, lighter than air, but heavier than mountains. For 3 years it had been part of her, and now she was voluntarily setting it aside. Her fingers trembled as she unwound it from around her throat, revealing first the relatively minor scarring at her collarbone. Jake's expression didn't change. His eyes remained fixed on her face, not dropping to examine what she was revealing. It was as if he understood that her courage was more important than his curiosity. "Keep going," he said softly. "You're doing beautifully." Eliza unwound another layer, then another, until finally the cloth fell away completely and she sat before him with her scars fully exposed for the first time in 3 years. The silence that followed was deafening. She couldn't bring herself to look at Jake's face, couldn't bear to see the moment when attraction turned to revulsion. The scarring was extensive, covering most of her chest and throat in twisted ridges of keloid tissue that caught the firelight like mountain ranges on her skin. Some areas were smooth and shiny, others puckered and raised, all of them a testament to the fire that had nearly claimed her life. In some places the scars were white, in others angry red, creating a patchwork of damaged skin that she'd been certain no one could ever find beautiful. The silence stretched on, seconds feeling like hours. Eliza's breathing became shallow and rapid as panic set in. Why wasn't he saying anything? Why wasn't he moving? Had the sight of her scars shocked him into stillness? "Please say something," she whispered, still not daring to look at his face. "Anything." When Jake finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "My God, Eliza, what you must have endured." The words weren't what she'd expected. There was no disgust in his tone, no revulsion, but there was something else. Something that made her finally brave enough to look at his face. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. Jake's gray eyes were bright with unshed tears, and his expression was one of profound sadness, mixed with something that looked almost like awe. He was staring at her scars, yes, but not with the horrified fascination she'd expected. Instead, he looked like a man contemplating a great work of art, something beautiful and tragic and meaningful all at once. "You survived this," he said quietly, his voice full of wonder. "You survived something that should have killed you, And you're still here, still fighting, still capable of love and trust and hope. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Do you have any idea how extraordinary that makes you? Eliza felt tears start to slip down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of shame. For the first time in 3 years, they were tears of relief. You're not disgusted? She managed to ask. Disgusted? Jake stood slowly and moved around the table toward her, his movements careful and deliberate. Eliza, these scars are proof of your strength. They're evidence that you fought death and won. How could I be disgusted by something so powerful? He knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level, and reached out to touch her face gently. You're beautiful, he said, his voice fierce with conviction. Not despite these scars, but with them. They're part of your story, part of what makes you who you are. But they're so ugly, Eliza protested. Years of self-hatred not easily overcome by one man's acceptance, no matter how sincere. No, Jake said firmly. They're not ugly. They're honest. They tell the truth about what you've been through and how strong you had to become to survive it. His thumb brushed away her tears with infinite gentleness. And the man who couldn't see that, who walked away from you because of these marks, he was a fool who never deserved you in the first place. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to, Jake leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to one of the scars on her collarbone. The touch was reverent, almost worshipful, as if he were kissing something sacred. Thank you, he whispered against her skin. Thank you for trusting me with this, for letting me see all of you. Eliza felt something break open inside her chest, not breaking in the sense of shattering, but like ice breaking up in spring, like something frozen finally beginning to thaw. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of believing herself unlovable, damaged beyond repair. But here was this man, looking at her scars and seeing not ugliness, but beauty, not weakness, but strength. I love you, she heard herself say, the words escaping before she could stop them. I know it's too soon. I know we haven't known each other long, but I love you, Jake Morrison. Jake's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I love you too, he said simply. All of you. Every beautiful, brave, scarred inch of you. He kissed her then, not the gentle, careful kiss of their first meeting, but something deeper and more passionate. His hands tangled in her hair, and she could taste the salt of her own tears on his lips. For the first time in 3 years, she felt beautiful. For the first time since the fire, she felt whole. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. What happens now, he asked, echoing her own question from their evening by the creek. Now, Eliza said, surprise evident in her own voice. I stop hiding. I stop letting fear make my decisions for me. I start living again. Jake's hands moved to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with such tenderness it made her heart ache. And us? What happens with us? Eliza looked into his storm-gray eyes, these windows to a soul that had seen her at her most vulnerable and found her worthy of love, and felt the last of her walls crumble away. Us, she said softly, we figure out together. Day by day, scar by scar, until there's nothing left hidden between us. But even as she spoke the words, even as Jake's acceptance washed over her like healing rain, a small part of her mind whispered warnings. This felt too good to be true, too perfect to last. What if his initial shock was just delayed? What if, in the harsh light of morning, he changed his mind about what he could handle? As if reading her thoughts, Jake spoke again, his voice low and intense. I need you to understand something, Eliza. What just happened between us? This isn't going to change. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up loving you just as much as I do right now. Next week, next month, next year, my feelings aren't going to disappear just because you've shown me your scars. How can you be so sure, she asked, voicing the fear that still lurked in her heart. Because, Jake said, his hands moving to trace the edges of her scars with reverent fingers, I've seen the worst thing you think there is to see about yourself, and it only makes me love you more. These marks tell the story of a woman who refused to give up, who found the strength to rebuild her life after losing everything. How could I not love a woman like that? As they sat together in the flickering firelight, Eliza finally understood what Mrs. Patterson had meant about courage. It wasn't the absence of fear. She was still afraid, would probably always carry some fear about how others perceived her. But courage was choosing love despite that fear, choosing to trust despite the risk of betrayal, choosing to hope despite the possibility of disappointment. And for the first time in 3 years, Eliza Hartwell was ready to be courageous. But as Jake helped her carefully wind the cloth back around her throat before their journey home, not because she was ashamed, but because the desert night was cold against newly exposed skin, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that they were being watched. Standing in the doorway of the line shack, looking out into the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, she thought she saw a shadow move among the cottonwoods. "What is it?" Jake asked, noticing her stillness. "Nothing," Eliza said, but her hand moved instinctively to check that her cloth was secure. "Just thought I saw something." Jake's expression grew alert, his body tensing with the kind of wariness that came from years of frontier living. "What kind of something?" Before Eliza could answer, a voice called out from the darkness beyond the trees, rough and familiar in a way that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. "Well, well, look what we have here." Thomas Brennan stepped into the circle of light, his face twisted with the same cruel smile she remembered from their last encounter 3 years ago. Behind him came two other men, both armed, both wearing the kind of expressions that promised trouble. "Hello, Eliza," Thomas said, his voice mocking. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" The blood in Eliza's veins turned to ice as Thomas Brennan stepped into the firelight, his cruel smile exactly as she remembered it from 3 years ago. Time seemed to slow as all the progress she'd made, all the healing Jake had begun in her heart, threatened to crumble under the weight of her past. "Thomas," she whispered, instinctively pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, even though the cloth was already securely in place. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you, my dear," Thomas replied, his voice dripping with false affection. "Did you really think you could disappear, and I wouldn't eventually track you down?" His eyes moved to Jake, taking in the protective way the cowboy had positioned himself between Eliza and the intruders. "And I see you found yourself a new protector. How touching." Jake's hand moved slowly toward his gun, but Thomas's men were already armed, their weapons trained on him with practiced ease. "I'd think twice about that, friend," Thomas said conversationally. "My associates here are very good at what they do." "What do you want, Brennan?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the obvious danger. He'd heard the name before. Eliza had mentioned Thomas during their conversation by the creek. Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "What I want is what was promised to me 3 years ago. What I paid for." His eyes fixed on Eliza with possessive hunger. "You see, Mr. Morrison," Jake replied curtly. "Mr. Morrison, you've been courting stolen goods. Eliza and I had an understanding before her unfortunate accident. I invested considerable time and money in our relationship, and then she disappeared like a thief in the night." Thomas took a step closer, ignoring the way Jake tensed. "I've spent 3 years tracking her down, and now I'm here to collect what's mine." "I'm not yours," Eliza said, finding her voice despite the terror that threatened to choke her. "I never was. You made that very clear when you saw my scars." Thomas's expression darkened. "You were damaged goods, it's true, but I'm a forgiving man, and I've had time to adjust my expectations. You'll find I'm much more understanding now." The lie was so transparent, so obviously rehearsed, that Jake felt fury rise in his chest like a living thing. This was the man who had abandoned Eliza when she needed him most, who had looked at her scars and walked away, leaving her to believe she was unlovable. And now he had the audacity to claim ownership of her? "The lady doesn't belong to you," Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She doesn't belong to anyone but herself." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong," Thomas replied, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a worn piece of paper, holding it up for them to see. A promissory note signed by Eliza herself. She borrowed $500 from me to pay for her medical treatment after the fire. The terms were very specific. She would repay me either in cash or in other services. Eliza's face went white as she stared at the document. She had been desperate after the fire, facing mounting medical bills with no way to pay them. Thomas had seemed like a savior then, offering help with no questions asked. She'd been too naive to read the fine print carefully, too grateful for his assistance to question his motives. "That note is 3 years old," she said, her voice shaking, "and I've been making payments." "Partial payments," Thomas interrupted. "You still owe me nearly $400 plus interest. At current rates, I'd say you owe me close to 800 now." He smiled coldly. "Of course, I'm willing to forgive the debt entirely if you come with me willingly." Jake stepped forward, every muscle in his body coiled for action, despite the guns trained on him. "She's not going anywhere with you." "That's really not your decision to make," Thomas said, his tone becoming more threatening. "This is a legal matter, Mr. Morrison. Eliza owes me money, and one way or another, she's going to pay." "I'll pay," Jake said suddenly, surprising everyone, including Eliza. "Whatever she owes you, I'll pay it. Right now." Thomas raised an eyebrow. $800? That's a lot of money for a railroad worker." "I have it," Jake replied, though Eliza could hear the strain in his voice. $800 was more than most men made in 2 years. It would wipe out his savings, everything he'd worked for since coming to Arizona. "Jake, no," Eliza said, turning to face him. "I can't let you do that. It's too much." "It's worth it," Jake said simply, his gray eyes fierce with determination. "You're worth it." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Here was this common laborer, this nobody, willing to bankrupt himself for a woman Thomas had discarded like damaged merchandise. The insult was intolerable. "How noble," Thomas sneered, "but I'm afraid money isn't all I'm after now. You see, Mr. Morrison, you've inconveniently interfered with my property. That makes this personal." "She's not property," Jake said, his hand inching toward his gun again. "And if you try to take her, you'll have to go through me." "That can be arranged," Thomas replied, nodding to his men. "But first, I think it's time everyone saw what you've been so eager to protect." His eyes glittered with malicious intent as he looked at Eliza. "Take off the cloth, my dear. Show your new friend what I saw 3 years ago. Let him see why I couldn't stand to touch you." "No," Eliza whispered, her hands flying to her throat. "Take it off," Thomas commanded, his voice harsh with authority, "or my men will do it for you." "Don't you touch her," Jake snarled. But one of Thomas's men pressed a gun barrel against his temple, freezing him in place. "The choice is yours, Eliza," Thomas said with false gentleness. "Remove the cloth yourself, or have it removed for you." For a moment, Eliza stood paralyzed by terror and shame, the old fears crashing over her like a tide. This was her nightmare come to life, being forced to expose herself, to relive the humiliation of 3 years ago. But then she looked at Jake's face, saw the fury and love blazing in his gray eyes, and something inside her shifted. "You know what, Thomas?" she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You're right. It is time everyone saw." Her hands moved to the pins at her throat, but not with the trembling fear of a victim, with the steady determination of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. "Eliza, you don't have to," Jake began, but she shook her head. "Yes, I do," she said, beginning to unwrap the cloth. "I've spent 3 years hiding from this man, letting his cruelty define how I see myself. But I'm not that frightened, broken woman anymore." The cloth fell away, revealing her scars to the flickering firelight. Thomas's men shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared for the extent of the scarring, but Thomas himself just smiled with satisfaction. "There," he said triumphantly. "Now you can see what I had to deal with, Mr. Morrison. Hideous, isn't it? No man should have to look at something so beautiful," Jake finished, his voice cutting through Thomas's cruel words like a blade. "So beautiful it takes my breath away." Thomas's smile faltered. "What?" "You heard me," Jake said, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face. "She's beautiful. These scars are proof of her strength, evidence that she survived something that would have killed a weaker person. They're not marks of shame. They're badges of honor." He addressed Eliza directly now, his voice soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I love you, Eliza Hartwell. I love your courage, your kindness, your incredible strength. And I love these scars because they're part of your story, part of what makes you the most remarkable woman I've ever known." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. This wasn't going according to his plan at all. He'd expected Jake to recoil in disgust, to abandon Eliza the way he himself had 3 years ago. Instead, the man was looking at her like she was some kind of goddess. "You're lying," Thomas snarled. "No man could find that attractive. You're just saying what she wants to hear." "No," Jake said firmly, taking a step toward Eliza despite the gun still trained on him. "I'm saying what I feel. What any decent man would feel for a woman this extraordinary." He reached out and gently touched one of her scars, his fingers reverent against her skin. "These marks don't make her less beautiful, Thomas. They make her more beautiful, because they show what she's capable of surviving." Thomas's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You're both insane. She's damaged goods, worthless. She's priceless," Jake interrupted, his voice ringing with conviction. "And the fact that you can't see that just proves you never deserved her in the first place." Something in Jake's absolute certainty, in the way he looked at Eliza like she was the most precious thing in the world, finally broke through 3 years of self-doubt and shame. Eliza felt the last of her emotional walls crumble, replaced by a strength she'd forgotten she possessed. "He's right," she said, turning to face Thomas with her chin held high. "I am extraordinary. I survived a fire that should have killed me, rebuilt my life from nothing, and found the courage to love again despite what you put me through. You're the one who's damaged, Thomas. You're the one who's worthless." The transformation in her was visible, like watching a butterfly emerge from its chrysalis. Where moments before she'd been cowering and afraid, now she stood tall and proud, her scars no longer hidden, but displayed like the marks of honor Jake had called them. Thomas stared at her in shock, unable to reconcile this confident, powerful woman with the broken, desperate creature he'd abandoned 3 years ago. His carefully laid plans were crumbling around him, and he could feel his control of the situation slipping away. "You still owe me money," he said weakly, grasping at the last thread of his authority. "Then I'll pay you," Eliza said calmly. "Every cent, with interest. But not because I belong to you, and not because I'm afraid of you, because I choose to close this chapter of my life once and for all." Jake reached into his coat and pulled out a thick roll of bills, his life savings, everything he'd worked for since coming to Arizona. "Here," he said, tossing the money at Thomas's feet, $800, just like you asked. Now get out of here and leave her alone." Thomas stared at the money for a long moment, then looked back at Eliza and Jake standing together, united against him. The love between them was so palpable it seemed to fill the small space, making his own bitter loneliness feel even more acute. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. He gestured to his men, who lowered their weapons with obvious relief. "Yes, it is," Eliza said firmly. "It's been over for 3 years, Thomas. You just refuse to accept it." As Thomas and his men disappeared into the darkness, taking the money but leaving their threats unfulfilled, Eliza turned to Jake with tears streaming down her face. "You gave him everything," she said. "Your whole savings, your future." "No," Jake said, pulling her into his arms. "I gave him paper and coins. My future is right here, in my arms. You're my future, Eliza. You're my everything." They held each other in the firelight, both of them trembling with relief and love, and the incredible realization that they'd survived not just Thomas's threats, but the deeper challenge of learning to trust again after betrayal. "What happens now?" Eliza asked, echoing the question that had become their refrain. "Now," Jake said, pressing a soft kiss to her temple, "we go home. We build a life together. We love each other without fear, without shame, without hiding." He pulled back to look at her face, his thumb gently tracing the edge of one of her scars. "And we never let anyone make us feel less than extraordinary again." As they prepared to leave the line shack, Eliza carefully folded the cloth she'd worn for 3 years. Not to hide behind anymore, but to keep as a reminder of how far she'd come, of the strength she'd found in learning to be vulnerable with the right person. The ride back to Copper Ridge was peaceful, filled with quiet conversation and gentle touches. They talked about the future now, about Jake's work with the railroad, about Eliza's skills as a seamstress, about the little house they might build together on the outskirts of town. "I love you," Eliza said as they reached the boarding house, the words coming easily now, without fear or reservation. I love you too, Jake replied, helping her down from the wagon. All of you. Every beautiful, brave, extraordinary inch of you. As he kissed her good night on Mrs. Patterson's front porch, Eliza finally understood what real love looked like. It wasn't the desperate, conditional affection Thomas had offered, dependent on her meeting his standards of physical perfection. Real love saw past surfaces to souls, found beauty in survival, and chose to stay even when staying was difficult. She was still scarred. She would always carry the marks of that terrible night 3 years ago. But she was no longer defined by them, no longer imprisoned by them. She was Eliza Hartwell, survivor of fire and cruelty and her own despair, beloved of Jake Morrison, and finally completely, beautifully free. The cloth remained folded in her dresser drawer that night, and for the first time in 3 years, she slept without its protection. Because she'd finally learned that real protection didn't come from hiding behind fabric and fear. It came from finding someone brave enough to love you exactly as you are, scars and all. And so ends the remarkable story of Eliza Hartwell and Jake Morrison, two wounded souls who found healing in each other's love. In the harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory, where survival often meant building walls against the world, they discovered that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in hiding our scars, but in revealing them to someone worthy of our trust. 6 months later, the good people of Copper Ridge would witness something extraordinary, a wedding where the bride wore no cloth around her throat. Eliza walked down the aisle of the small desert church with her head held high, her scars visible to all, radiant with the confidence that comes from being truly, completely loved. Jake waited for her at the altar with tears of joy in his storm-gray eyes, proving once again that real love sees beauty where others see only imperfection. Mrs. Patterson, of course, took full credit for bringing them together, claiming she'd known from the moment Jake first asked about Eliza that they were meant for each other. Love has a way of finding what it's looking for, she would tell anyone who'd listen, especially when it's patient enough to look past the surface. They built their little house on the outskirts of town, just as they dreamed during that peaceful ride back from the line shack. Eliza's seamstress skills and Jake's work with the expanding railroad provided them with a comfortable living, but more importantly, they provided each other with something neither had dared hope for, a love that grew stronger with each passing day. The cloth that had once been Eliza's shield remained folded in their bedroom dresser, not forgotten, but transformed. No longer a symbol of shame, it became a reminder of how far she'd traveled, both literally and emotionally. Sometimes on quiet evenings, she would take it out and tell Jake new details about her journey west, about the fears she'd conquered and the strengths she discovered within herself. Their story became legend in Copper Ridge, the tale of the mysterious woman with the cloth and the cowboy who taught her that scars tell stories of survival, not shame. It gave hope to others who carried their own hidden wounds, who believed themselves unworthy of love because life had marked them in visible ways. But perhaps the most beautiful part of their story was this. When their first child was born 3 years later, a daughter with Jake's gray eyes and Eliza's auburn hair, she would grow up knowing that scars are not something to hide from, but badges of honor that prove we are stronger than whatever tried to break us. Love, after all, is not about perfection. It's about seeing someone's flaws, their wounds, their imperfections, and choosing to cherish them anyway. It's about understanding that the most beautiful people are those who have been tested by fire and emerged not unburned, but unbroken. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the American West, where love conquered fear and courage triumphed over shame. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Wild West Stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more tales of love, redemption, and second chances to life. Until next time, remember, every scar tells a story, and every story deserves to be heard with compassion. This is Wild West Stories, where the frontier never truly ends. It just finds new hearts to call home.